Trade.
We're all set to go. Good morning. Good morning. My name is David Biette. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for our program on border and preclearance issues, among other things. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of other things as well. Just for those of you who are new to the Wilson Center and for those of you in the ether who will be watching this either now or later, the Wilson Center is the United States Memorial to Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. He's our only president with a PhD. Unless I sort of jokingly say our other presidents got marble, he got a research institution. So within that, the Canada Institute, one of the 23 programs here, looks at Canada and Canada-U.S. issues so that we can get policy here a little bit more informed about what's going on in Canada and Canada-U.S. It's while it's our largest trading partner, we get more energy from Canada. We don't often think about Canada, and Canada often gets sideswiped in a lot of legislation. So we try to bring Canada issues to the forefront so that people are more conversant on it, and when policy is made, it's better made. We do have publications. Our last one was on privacy at the border. The privacy officer for the DHS wrote the American piece, and we had a security expert in Canada write the other, and it got good play. It was in Maclean's magazine about 2 weeks ago, and there should be copies of it out there if you haven't seen it. It's also on the web in PDF for those of you who don't have the opportunity to pick one up. Today's program, as I said, is going to be webcast. It will be archived. Our other programs also are archived on the Center's website, and they are used. I had a student yesterday tell me that she wrote a paper on one of them, so that made me feel pretty good. I'd like to thank the Quebec government for their support of the Canada Institute, and in particular a conference series of which this is part. They're great colleagues, and a lot of the issues that the Quebec government itself feels are important in the Canada-U.S. relationship are also important in the larger relationship. So let me get going with introducing our moderator for this morning's panel. Stuart Verdery, second one in, is the founder and partner at Monument Policy Group, one of the fastest growing government consulting firms in Washington. He was the first Assistant Secretary of Policy and Planning at the Department of Homeland Security after serving as General Counsel to Senator Don Nichols, Assistant Senate Majority Leader. He served as counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chairman Orrin Hatch, and while at the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, he worked for Virginia Senator John Warner. Please help me welcome Stuart Verdery, who will moderate this morning's first panel.
So I think we'll keep things casual. It's very nice to be here. You guys have a great center. We've done a lot of good work together, and I think it's a very helpful voice to bringing some common sense to very key border issues. And I'm not going to talk for very long here at the beginning, as the panelists here actually have more insight. As they say in Washington, I was in government for a while, and now I left, and I get paid to help try to clean up the mess that I made. It's perfect. So I'm going to leave it to Kevin as a former and now current again DHSer to talk about some of the key things that DHS is up to. As was mentioned, I had the pleasure of working 2 years at DHS as Assistant Secretary, and I can tell you that the issues we worked on with Canada, which much closer in time to 9/11, were incredibly interesting and incredibly critical. I think sometimes the media tends to focus more on threats and opportunities and risks further overseas and other parts of the world, but I think anyone who looks at the economics knows that the border we share with Canada is probably the most important border in the world in terms of having economic growth and then bringing the security we need along with it. And even though our governments get along great in many respects, and particularly in operational issues, law enforcement and the like, we've seen a lot of difficulty over the last 10 years in coming up with a vision for a smart border that also takes into account both our foreign policy needs and our security needs. One interesting thing, and I'm not sure how much our panelists will talk about it, but I might ask a few questions about it, is with the recent elections here in Washington, we've seen people leaving office. We've seen people rise and fall in prominence, and some of the folks who have been most interested in border issues have seen a real turn for their political fortunes. We've had people like Senator Dorgan retire from North Dakota. We've had Congresswoman Slaughter, who's been very interested in border issues from her perch near Buffalo, lose the chairmanship of the Rules Committee in the House. At the same time, we've seen people like Senator Schumer, who's been a real voice for activity at the border, gain even more prominence in the Democratic caucus. And we've seen people like Senator Baucus from Montana, who's been a huge player on trade issues, again, keep his chairmanship. And so I think you've seen a little bit of a up and down in terms of some issues. And it'll be very interesting to see how the Republicans, who tend to be more focused on southern border and immigration issues and concerns with Mexico, how they deal with the very important issues of the northern border as well. One question I want to throw out there, and I hope our panelists will address, is we've seen a lot of progress over the last half decade or so on facilitating the movement of passengers, of travelers. And I think both our customs services, who are both going to be represented here today, deserve a lot of credit on implementing programs that move people back and forth in a smart way. We have a great trusted traveler program. We've worked on trucker issues and the like. But why haven't we been able to see similar progress in the cargo environment? And obviously the inability to find a preclearance, a conclusion to the preclearance negotiations under the last administration, I know were of great disappointment to many in the shipping community and many following the bilateral relationship. Are there ways to restart that? Are there ways to recalibrate that type of program that might allow for, again, the preclearance idea that has drawn great support in the intellectual and business communities? I'm going to hold the panelists, I hope, to a strict 10-minute or so presentation. We've got a couple PowerPoints from a couple of them, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and maybe I can gin up a little partisan banter up here amongst the panelists. I'm going to introduce you in turn as you want to speak, and I'm going to turn first to my far left. Kevin McAleenan is a former colleague of mine at DHS, and sometimes you hear in this town anyway of especially on my side of the aisle, on the Republican side, government bureaucrats run amok and this type of thing. And if anyone wanted to see the counterweight to that image of that stereotype, I would point out Kevin. He just returned to CBP from a stint in the private sector, has 2 young kids, and has forsaken time with his family and fortune to provide great government service back to CBP. I had the pleasure of working with him when he worked for Commissioner Bonner, first as a policy advisor, then as the director of counterterrorism, and then as the LA port director, and really brought most of the good programs you think of that CBP has helped implement the last 10 years. Kevin has had an integral role, if not the leading role. He rejoined CBP earlier this year in July as the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Field Operations, the small task of running 20 major field operations and only 327 ports of entry?
I think it's up to 331. The stat changes regularly. So. Okay,
well, at least you can keep on top of that. And over 20,000 employees as CBP's workforce has grown over the last decade. And I believe the bios have been handed out to the crowd, so I won't read through all of it. But I just say that you're lucky to have one of the best thinkers and most innovative policy people I've ever worked with. So we'll turn to Kevin for your opening salvo. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not sure that it was that helpful that you set expectations that high. It was a very kind introduction. I'm very happy to see former Assistant Secretary Verdery again and to talk up here on the panel today, to be with my colleague from CBSA, Paul Haddow, and to meet Catherine Friedman and to hear her challenging, I think, presentation on how we can do better. Very happy to be here today. I agree with Stuart's remarks on the importance of the Wilson Center. It's a good group. I saw the invite list, and hopefully we can have a robust discussion on northern border and preclearance issues. Stuart did mention my daughters. I talk about my daughters a lot, but there is a point to this story. My 3-year-old, I'm working with geography with her. We look at the globe and we try to remember the key countries, and try to use mnemonic devices with kids to help them to get engaged. Australia, that's where Uncle Milt is from, and Spain, that's where Daddy went on a business trip, and Egypt's where the pyramids are from. And she saw those in a Little Einsteins cartoon. You're familiar with the Little Einsteins? So when it came to Canada, we didn't really have a special reference point, and I came back from a COAC meeting in Detroit a few months ago, and I brought a little trinket back. It's a toy truck from the Detroit field office. Government's very good at creating trinkets and handing them out. And the next time we did our Globe game, we got to Canada, and she remembered the name of the country without me prompting her, and she said, "Canada, Daddy, that's where the trucks come from." which I think is pretty appropriate given that there are about 5.5 million of them last year, in 28,000 trains, some of them a mile long, 28 million vehicles, and almost 12 million preclearance passengers at the 9 preclearance airports. So a tremendous volume. The numbers are increasing as our economies rebound slowly but surely over the past year as well. So how do we work to address this massive volume and ensure that it moves securely and expeditiously, and to address some of the challenges that Stuart raised? And frankly, our new administration, the Secretary and our Commissioner have upped the ante in terms of this challenge. Secretary Napolitano has made Canada a major priority, northern border. She doesn't mention the southern border issues without mentioning that we need to have a dual focus on the northern border. She's developed a very close relationship with Minister Taves. They've met several times already, most recently after the Cross-Border Crime Forum meeting just last month. Our Commissioner as well has given us a challenge because he basically sees secure and expeditious flow of trade across the northern border as absolutely critical to our economic competitiveness going forward as nations. He has challenged us to reduce transaction costs, to reduce the times for trade to move, and wants us to really think beyond, taking our current programs to the next level, and to really think beyond at what we can do in a transformative way. And I think the discussion this morning will touch on some of those concepts and ideas. Our engagement with our Canadian partners, I think, is at as high a level as it's ever been. We don't maintain the mechanisms that we created right after 9/11 necessarily with the shared border accords and the quarterly meetings, but instead we talk at the Commissioner and President level of CBSA more like weekly. They have video teleconferences, direct email exchanges that we then get forward and take action on this initiative that we've discussed at the agency head level. The communication is just outstanding. We've also created several new kind of matrix organization policy and operational groups within CBP that are really focused on Canada and northern border issues. We have a Canada IPCC. I will tell you what the acronym is, although it's maybe not going to be that enlightening. It's Integrated Policy Coordination Cell. That's basically our dedicated matrix group, which has permanent staffing to think about Canada issues, and we've outlined an ambitious work agenda for them in concert with a like group on the CBSA side to work on information sharing, harmonization, border infrastructure planning, and in the long term, a lot of key concerns that we're trying to move forward on, and that structure has really allowed us to maintain focus and momentum because there are people that are senior people in our organization that are thinking about that as their priority every day. We've also created a trade IPCC, which is working on a number of issues. For those of you involved in COAC and Can-Am, you've seen lots of the initiatives coming out of this group. We're piloting several new approaches to managing by account, to improving our ability to segment by risk, which is another issue that I'll mention in a moment, a key focus for our Commissioner in taking our risk segmentation approaches to the next level. But that's the Center for Excellence and Expertise. This concept is working with a specific industry, pulling together the expertise from all of the elements within CBP that deal with that industry, and trying to ensure consistent, clear practices and expeditious trade practices across an entire industry. The account executive pilot is assessing those same concepts, but from a specific account, working with one or more major companies that are involved in international trade. And so we're testing these concepts. We're trying to push them to the next level. And we're also looking at some longer-term initiatives, the concept of single entry with both Canada and Mexico. So, streamlining the information and documentation that the trade has to provide to our agencies. And I think a lot of those initiatives have very good promise going forward. In terms of preclearance in general, as Stuart mentioned, the negotiations that didn't come to fruition on the land border side, But we believe in the overall sense that preclearance is really an important aspect of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to employ to thin the border, if you will, in our new commissioner's construction. Instead of thickening it with extra security initiatives, we want to thin the border to make it as easy to cross for our legitimate traders and travelers as possible. And that's a two-step process. One is taking our partnership programs to the next level. We just crested 10,000 members in our CTPAT program. FAST continues to be a very strong program that's critical to the movement of trade on the northern border. Our Trusted Traveler program that Stuart mentioned, we're up to 450,000 members in Nexus, our critical partnership with Canada. Our Global Entry program is going to crest 100,000 by the end of the year. I'm assured. That's our goal set by the commissioner. We're at 98,400 today, so we've got to get those interviews in. Hopefully, people don't skip interviews and do holiday shopping. I think we'll make it. But that's a critical effort for us. It just has so many benefits in terms of our time at the border, in terms of moving the people that we're really not worried about and the goods that we're not worried about through the process as quickly as possible, so we can focus on this much smaller portion of trade and travel that we think is risky. And so where does preclearance fit into that? Well, we think it fits in wherever we can employ it in an effective manner for security, in a cost-efficient manner for applying our resources, and in a way that expedites trade. Those are our general criteria. There are some challenges with preclearance. Stuart mentioned the issue of authorities. It's very difficult when even close partners maintain different legal regimes, different constitutional frameworks, to ensure that nations operating in each other's territory can approach the security aspects of preclearance in a harmonized manner, in a manner that meets the requirements of their home country. That's an ongoing challenge in looking at preclearance applications. The cost of preclearance is another element. As you know, we know we are in a pretty austere budget environment with the economy going forward. There have been signals from both parties that they'd like to preserve a lot of the defense and security spending. I think that's going to be a big challenge. It's going to be an interesting. We actually don't have a federal budget, as you probably all know, a continuing resolution going through December 18th. It's going to be very interesting to see how the funding environment proceeds going forward. We're clear it's going to be flat, and the concern is that it might come down. So within that environment, we have to understand that preclearance is a costly operation. It's more than double to have CBP personnel posted abroad than domestically. It's about 400,000 on average abroad, about 150,000 for an officer domestically, and that is not a small challenge in general, and certainly not in this budget environment. There's the concept of adequate infrastructure. Granted, that's true on both sides of the border, but it's an important consideration in looking at an appropriate preclearance location. And then ensuring that there's adequate traffic. It can't be applied in a way that it takes the trade out of their normal flow. We understand that. So as you're looking at locations, they have to work within the current supply chain, within the current business practices of the trade. So those are the kind of things we look at and analyze in considering different preclearance options. And so all of that said, I don't want to talk too much because I think it's going to be the exchange, and if Stuart can stimulate some partisan discussion, as he put it, up here, I think that's going to be the more interesting part of the morning. But the clear message from CBP is that we remain open to all initiatives that support secure flows across the border. In this budget and economic environment with no, I mean, that's another key piece of the budget piece. The infrastructure side, we don't see getting funded as robustly as we'd hoped. It does not appear that key projects like the Blue Water Bridge and Port Huron are going to have the GSA funding that we had hoped in the last couple of years of planning. That's an issue. So given those constraints, we're going to need to continue to work together with our Canadian counterparts, continue to advance our efforts on risk segmentation and partnership, and to push those to the next level, and to be open to preclearance concepts that make sense in this environment. So that's our goal and direction, and look forward to our discussion this morning.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for those remarks, and I appreciate you keeping them in the schedule. One member of, or thing about Congress I forgot to mention. We mentioned the Blue Water Bridges. We do have two new chairmen of major committees from Michigan. They just announced yesterday Fred Upton will be chairing the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, and Dave Camp will be chairing the Ways and Means Committee, both from Michigan. So you may see a little more receptivity to Michigan-specific things than maybe we might have seen otherwise. But with that, when we move to our second panelist, and you've got a presentation, is that correct?
Yeah, very brief
okay.
one, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, you going to do it from the podium? Or?
Could someone, yeah.
Pointer?
Sure.
Okay.
Do I just...
Excellent. Well, Paul Howdow, while you're looking up the PowerPoint Gizmo, is the Senior Policy Advisor to the Vice President for Programs at the CBSA. And again, as you look at his a full bio in your materials, a tremendous amount of experience working on trade issues in Canada, and had worked as the negotiator on several U.S.-Canada relationships and initiatives, including preclearance, highly appropriate, and also the Canada response to the U.S. Secure Flight Program. Had began his career at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and also worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade for many years. And Paul, really appreciate you being here today. I'm sure you've bumped into Kevin along the way in your travels on border issues, and we very much look forward to your remarks and presentation.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Stuart. I have a very brief presentation. Being asked to speak on preclearance for 10 minutes is a bit of a challenge. I could talk about it for days, but I just thought I'd keep it at a fairly general level. And I support everything that Kevin just said in terms of the commitment, the continued commitment. And I can assure you that it's interesting. I mean, we've gone from a very bureaucratic or heavily architectured process under the SPP, for example, where you had 15, 20 departments in each government meeting, ministers, big folders full of 5-digit long initiatives. But now what we have is the commissioner phoning the president of CBSA on a weekly basis saying, we've got this problem, we've got to fix it. How can we fix it? What's your problem? How can I help you to help me? So in many ways it's a lot more efficient. You don't see necessarily the large sort of political meetings in various places. However, having said that, at the head of state level, head of government level in Canada, Prime Minister and President really get along when they've met about border issues. They're talking on the same wavelength. So the situation's all good. In terms of preclearance, I mean, what are the benefits of it? And I just thought I'd summarize things because there is some confusion when people talk about preclearance programs. When you dig a bit, they're really talking about trusted trader programs or trusted traveler programs. And preclearance is something a little different. What it's about is sort of, say, the United States moving their clearance process onto Canadian soil, and, say, Canada doing the same thing. And that way, from an inspecting country's perspective, you're assessing and mitigating the risks earlier in the trade and travel continuum. Not a lot earlier, but earlier. More fundamentally, though, it's all about it's a tool, as Kevin said, to try to address congestion, choke points at the border, where it makes sense. We have a large border. We have a lot of small ports of entry. In some of those ports of entry, rather than both of us having a couple of folks, staring across 50 yards, it might make sense to house them in one place and have them co-designated to do certain things. Maybe not everything, but certain things. So it's a tool that we need to use to maintain security, maintain it in a more efficient fashion, and continue to facilitate low-risk trade between our two countries. The big examples that people have been talking about are air preclearance, big success. Started in 1952, Toronto's airport, currently called Lester Pearson. It was formalized in a 1974 agreement. And now there are U.S. CBP officers at 8 Canadian airports. And my numbers were about 13.6 million, but 10 million, 11 million passengers in the last fiscal year were cleared in Canada before they arrived in the States. Now that's
We didn't lose 1.5 million passengers there. We'll have to reconcile the numbers.
Anyway.
They're stuck on the tarmac.
Yeah.
But the numbers are large. The numbers are very significant. And let's say 10 million. That's 10 million less people that hit the CBP infrastructure at U.S. airports. And I agree with Kevin that it's not cheap to deploy people abroad, although it's probably cheaper to deploy someone in Canada than would be in Paris or something like that. But and that's one of the constraints about extending this highly successful program more generally. But just for those of you who may not be aware, so the benefits to the U.S. inspection infrastructure are clear, but also the benefits to the traveling public are clear in the sense that you get pre-cleared in Canada, and when you arrive at a U.S. airport, your flight is treated as a domestic flight, so you're good to go as soon as you land. So there are advantages to both sides. There have been requests. Of course, everybody likes a good thing. But as Kevin mentioned, it's not cheap. And there has to be some metrics, some volume thresholds to be met. There may be more creative ways in which people who would like to have it could help CBP meet the incremental costs, but that's down the road. But right now, it's a very, very successful program in and of itself. In addition, it can be used as a platform to sort of build further security-based facilitation programs, such as preclearance of in-transit passengers, and a project that we have in Vancouver, where you can transit without an in-transit visa if you're on a certain airline, coming from a certain place, etc. So we can use preclearance as a platform to provide even more beneficial programs. Land preclearance was, again, it started off as a very practical solution to a very practical problem, which was that the U.S. inspection facilities at Buffalo needed to expand, and there wasn't a lot of room to expand in Buffalo. There would have had to have been a rather disruptive destruction of a neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, across the river on the Canadian side, tons of land. So, and the obverse was true at Lansdowne, Thousand Islands, where we needed to expand. We didn't have the space, but just across the river, there was tons of land on the U.S. side. So, again, very practical, can we look at ways where we pre-clear on the U.S. side at Lansdowne and the U.S. pre-clears at the Fort Erie side at Buffalo. Difficult negotiations. As Kevin mentioned, at the end of the day, they ended because of the problem of, can you really be as effective doing what you do under another country's laws? Now, some would argue, I would argue that yes, you can be, but again, it's a legitimately held concern. And it's a concern that I think was addressed very seriously, and I know my counterpart at the time was Paul Rosenzweig, a very creative negotiator, and we looked at all kinds of ways to get around difficult issues. And at the end of the day, a decision was made that it's just not going to work in the minds of the U.S. government, which is a completely legitimate perspective. Having said that, we accomplished quite a bit in terms of we dealt with a lot of difficult issues. Arming, we dealt with it. Immunity for inspecting officers in the host country was dealt with. Information sharing, very complex, politically charged issue. We found a way around it. But at the end of the day, it was just a question, as Kevin summarized, of the authorities. Could you feel you were being as effective if you couldn't do something in Canada that you could do at home, or you could do it, but it would be done differently? And it was a difficult call. having said that, you have to look back and say, well, what was the real problem? The problem wasn't with cargo. The problem was with people. The problem was with high-risk people. Now, lots happened since then. We've entered into a much deeper cooperation with CBP on high-risk targeting, on joint threat and risk assessments, et cetera. So just because it couldn't happen in 2007 doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future. It all depends on the amount of trust you have in the other person's information, getting it on a timely basis. So we keep moving forward, and the cooperation now is better than it was then. It was good then. It's better today. But the problem is with people, not with cargo. So let's look to the future. I think, as Kevin mentioned, it's still a useful tool in the toolbox. And I guess one, and I should be clear, this isn't the official Government of Canada position. I just thought I would put something out to stimulate debate.
Should we turn off the recording?
Well, I think it's okay.
With WikiLeaks, they find out.
Well, they're going to find it out anyway, so might as well find out in real time. It might be better than trying to come up with a broad, comprehensive commitment to do pre-clearance in all modes, at all times, in all places, for all streams. That maybe to build off the tool in the toolbox model and to say, certain problems present themselves to you for which pre-clearance could be the answer. It could be an effective, cost-effective, efficient, secure answer. And those problems emerge in all modes: air, rail, marine, and highway. And so, certain situations you could imagine would call for maybe full pre-clearance on the other side. So primary, secondary, people, goods, the whole full meal deal. Others you might say, well, and this may be in a small port mode where you say, look, we'll do primary there, but we can do secondary on our own soil. Or maybe we won't do it for people, but we can do it for cargo. And in some places that makes sense. If 80% of your traffic across a bridge is cargo or commercial shipments, because cargo entails a driver, then, if you can tackle that, you've got 80% of the problem tackled. In other cases, if it's only 10% of your traffic, then, similar, even within cargo, you could imagine a scenario where, well, at a certain crossing, of all the commercial shipments, 70% of them are CT-PAT, PIP, FAST kind of shipments. Well, that would argue for, well, if we could deal with that problem, so never mind all commercial shipments, but even the trusted stuff, if we could nail that down, then we've solved a good portion of the problem. So it may be something that, as we look forward, it would be better to do on defining the solution to fit the problem, rather than trying to get everything all at once. And there are different problems in all modes. There are concerns, there are opportunities in rail, opportunities in air, there's opportunities in commercial shipments. So I would like to put that out there as something to maybe provoke some discussion as we move forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and perhaps that will be a basis for conversation when we get to the Q&A portion of the program. Our third and final panelist today is Catherine Brick Friedman. She serves as the Deputy Director of the University of Buffalo Regional Institute for the last nearly 5 years, and also works with the Director on Strategic Planning for the Regional Institute, and directs and leads the Region's Edge, the Institute's binational program. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at her writing and commenting on these types of issues, it's really worth your time. I had a chance to look at it a little bit over the last couple of days, and really a great thinker on these types of issues. And the good thing is, as a non-government employee, she can say whatever she wants and doesn't get in trouble with the boss, right? So thank you Thank you so much for coming down, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. And actually, I'd like to just take a minute and thank David for inviting me and Ken for organizing this workshop. I think it's really important. It's really, really good stuff. I'm going to wrap up our panel discussion, take the next 10 minutes or so to provide you with a framework, a way of thinking about preclearance programs at a broader policy level, and then talk to you a little bit about two of the programs that have been established in the binational region that I hail from, the binational Buffalo-Niagara region. As Paul mentioned, and as Ron Reines knows very well, there have been attempts to establish other programs in our region to no avail, and they can certainly speak to that particular issue better than I can. But I'm going to focus on two of the programs that have met with some success, give you a little bit of a comparative perspective. We work quite closely with colleagues out west at the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. So we have a little bit of comparative data for you to absorb. And then very briefly discuss a couple of challenges on the ground in the trenches that folks have experienced with these programs. And then again, sort of bring it back up to a 20,000 foot level and give you my perspective on the broader challenge that policymakers and folks here in Washington are grappling with when it comes to these programs. So to begin, in my view, I think what we are all talking about and what we are grappling with are issues concerning border governance. How do Canada and the United States best govern the northern border? And by border governance, I mean, how do these countries organize and act to establish a coherent vision on border policy? How do Canada and the United States allocate resources when it comes to the border? Thirdly, how are border goals achieved by both parties? And last, how are interests between security and economy negotiated between these two countries? And in my view, preclearance programs actually fall under this last border governance prong. How to negotiate interests between security and economy in a way where it's not a zero-sum game, but it can be a non-zero-sum game and a win-win for all parties involved. Now, with regard to preclearance programs and people in the binational Buffalo-Niagara region, one of the programs that is on the ground is the Nexus program. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Nexus, it's not technically a preclearance program. It's actually referred to as a pre-screened travelers program, but I include it in my presentation because it falls under that broader conversation of negotiating the trade-offs between security and economy, and it actually deals with people as opposed to goods. And that's particularly important in the region that I come from, in the binational Buffalo-Niagara region, because if you look at our binational region as a whole, it's approximately comprised of 8.6 million people. Roughly 7 million or so folks on the Canadian side of the border and 1 million or so folks on the Western New York side of the border. This particular program is important to our region because over the next 15 years or so, that population is expected to grow by almost 3 million people, meaning the binational regional population is expected to grow to almost 11 million people by 2020, 2025. And although this doesn't concern, preclearance of goods per se, those people are important to the regional economy, to the binational commerce in terms of shopping, tourism, sports, recreation, air travel, et cetera, et cetera. So Nexus is an important program that has met with some success. I mean, there certainly are criticisms of Nexus, but it's been able to negotiate those competing interests in a way that has resulted in a win-win for both sides, for both interests, security and economy. The second program that's on the ground and that deals with goods as opposed to people is the FAST program. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, FAST is a commercial clearance program that is designed to ensure security while expediting trade across the border. It's a joint initiative between Canada and the United States, and it incorporates participants or clears participants who are determined to be low risk. Now, with regard to the FAST program, there are 105 commercial ports of entry across the northern border and the southern border. Okay, so this figure takes into account both borders. And there are 55 dedicated fast lanes at these ports of entry along both borders. Along the northern border in particular, although there are fast programs or fast lanes in states like Maine and out in North Dakota, they are primarily concentrated in New York State, Michigan, and Washington State. Now, when I was asked to speak to you this morning on preclearance program, Ken actually asked if I could talk about wait times and look at wait time metrics as an indicator of effectiveness, in particular for the FAST preclearance program. And so I dutifully reached out to folks in my region, border operators. I talked to CBP and CBSA folks in our region and some of the contacts that I had in Ottawa and Washington. And I found out that there really is no centralized source that documents wait times for the FAST program vis-a-vis regular commerce across the border so that we could get a sense as to whether FAST really is resulting in more efficiencies at the border when it comes to commercial trade. And now, there may be a person in DHS or somebody up in Ottawa who actually is holding this information. I just have not been able to find this person. It was actually suggested that I submit a FOIL request to see if either of the DHS in particular would be able to come up with the information for me. So I haven't done that. And in any event, so we don't really have hard and fast data on wait time metrics in order to get a sense as to whether a program like FAST has been effective in terms of efficiencies at the border. However, my colleagues out at the Border Policy Research Institute out at Western Washington University were part of a broader study that took place in that region back in 2009. It was the International Mobility Trade Corridor Commercial Vehicle Survey Study. And this is a study where they actually took 20 or 30 students from Western Washington University, put them out on the border, gave them survey instruments, and they were able to ask truckers and passengers a whole host of different questions that were related to both security and economy. Now, the survey was great, and they were able to mine a whole treasure trove of data. I'm just going to focus on the data relevant for this morning's presentation regarding effectiveness of the FAST preclearance program out in the Cascade Gateway, and in particular the fast lane at the northbound for the Pacific Highway and southbound for the Pacific Highway. According to their survey and their results, the total time in average minutes that a trucker would spend in 2009 in the fast lane or a participant in the FAST program was 3 minutes. That included 2 minutes average queue time of 2 minutes, and then an inspection time average of 69 seconds. So there was a total time of 3 minutes in the fast lane versus 17 minutes if you were a non-fast participant just going through the usual border lane, the usual border crossing. Southbound, we see similar results. 21 average minutes spent between queuing up and inspection time versus 80 minutes in a non-fast lane. And that was in 2006. In 2009, and this is, to the credit of DHS and the Canadian Border Services agencies, they were able to reduce that time from 21 minutes down to 8. So this survey, again, demonstrates that at least out in the Pacific Gateway, and I think intuitively we all probably think that the results should be similar across the northern border, that the FAST program has been fairly effective in cutting down wait times and contributing to a more efficient flow of goods across the border. As I said, in Buffalo, Niagara, we don't have access to that kind of data. We haven't done a survey. We don't know what those wait times are, but another measure, in my view, of effectiveness is by looking at how often FAST is used out of total border crossings in the Buffalo, or out of total times commercial trucks cross the border, how many use the fast lane. And in some research that we did back in 2007, 2008, we found that in our region, primarily most exports in the region are accomplished via truck as opposed to train, and that out of that 91 or 92% of exports or freight crossings by truck, 23% of commercial truckers use the fast lanes. So we think it's demonstrates, and again, this was 2 years or so ago, so we would expect that there would be more usage of fast now, but 23% I think is a fairly decent percentage in terms of trying to measure the effectiveness of the FAST program. At that time, we compared effectiveness of FAST to the Peace Arch and the Pacific Highway out west, and we found that only 5% of commercial vehicles use the fast lane out west. And so for us at the Regional Institute and at the Border Policy Research Institute, it raised a couple of different questions, right? I think probably the biggest question was why? Why is FAST so much more effective, or seems to be used more at a crossing like Buffalo, Niagara versus a crossing, the crossings that are out west? And we came up with a couple of different possibilities. One was commodity structure. Ports like Buffalo, Niagara, and Detroit, for example, are primarily dependent on manufactured goods, in particular automobiles and auto parts. And these are commodities that seem to be more amenable to FAST and more amenable to the requirements of the FAST program. And it seems as if manufactured goods and carriers and manufacturers that are involved in the just-in-time delivery system are better able to utilize FAST when compared, for example, to folks that transport goods over the border out west. It's primarily agricultural goods, okay? And those sorts of truckers and the producers of those agricultural goods don't find FAST to be a great option. So commodity structure is a challenge for the program, because we do know that at the ports of entry all along the northern border, the commodities that flow through the ports are varied. They are extraordinarily different, and so that poses a problem for a program like FAST. Secondly, port director discretion also, we think, is an issue or a challenge for FAST. These are the in the trenches, on the ground challenges. When you have a fast lane that is not being utilized to the extent envisioned or to the extent it could be. The idea is that maybe a port director could, if there's backup in commercial traffic in the non-fast lanes, perhaps a port director could redesignate a fast lane to use, or to utilize and divert some of that traffic into the fast lane. Some regions have met with success in that regard. Some regions still are experiencing very little discretion at the port level. The port directors have very little discretion with regard to switching up the lanes, if you will, on any given day, depending on the flow of traffic. And again, it gets into the diversity of the ports across the border, and it poses a challenge for folks in Washington and Ottawa in dealing with these issues. And a third challenge in the trenches that was highlighted by a colleague of mine, Bill Anderson, at the University of Windsor, is this common queue problem. Regardless of whether a truck uses a fast lane or a non-fast lane, at many border crossings, they all access the actual crossing via the same road, and they all have to queue up via the same highway. And if you're a fast commercial vehicle or a non-fast commercial vehicle, if there is a mile-long backup down, a highway, you're stuck. And so Bill has actually suggested, and again, this gets to some of the infrastructure issues that were talked about earlier, suggested building out separate infrastructure to, again, reach more efficiencies for participants in the FAST program versus the non-FAST program. So that was just sort of a snapshot of some of the issues in my region, and as I said, some of the challenges at the micro level, or challenges in the trenches that folks on the ground are dealing with every day. I'd like to end by taking us back up to that 20,000-foot level and encourage you to, as policymakers and folks working on these issues, to think about the issue a little bit more broadly. As I suggested, the pre-clearance programs that I talked about are a microcosm of this broader issue that both Canada and the United States are dealing with in terms of negotiating the interests of security and economy. And I would encourage you to not just think about it as Canada and the United States figuring out a way to make the northern border work, but in reality, I think the bigger elephant in the room is thinking about North America as a region in a globalized world. And in my view, the pre-clearance programs at the Canadian-U.S. border are really just a snapshot of this broader issue that's confronting U.S. policymakers and Canadian policymakers. To me, sitting in Buffalo, New York, it looks like policymakers need to consider the collective competitiveness of these two countries in the global marketplace at a time when other regions throughout the world are breaking down barriers to the free flow of goods and services and people. We in North America are building up barriers to the free flow of goods and services and people, and I'm not questioning the need for that. I'm just saying it's been a fact in the post September 11th environment, and I would encourage you, folks here in Washington and folks here who may be here from Ottawa, to look at this as a microcosm of this bigger issue, because it really is going to impact the collective competitiveness of these two countries for decades to come. So, thank you.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. And I think if my watch/BlackBerry is right, we've got about 25 minutes for some questions if we're going to stay on schedule. And I've got a bunch, but I think it's probably fair if you all have been sitting patiently and listening for quite a while if we throw it open for some questions from the audience. And if you could raise your hand and identify your organization or affiliation, and remember, it's a question, not a filibuster. and be helpful. And we'll try to go through as many as we can. Over here on the on my left.
My name is David North. I'm with the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. that deals with immigration policy issues, not trade issues. About 20 years ago, I did a little study for the German Marshall Fund of the United States about preclearance at airports. And there's some in other parts of the world besides our northern border. And one of the advantages that was quoted to me at the time, and I'm curious as to whether or not this is still an advantage, was on the enforcement side, simply because you have more time with an individual traveler as he approaches the departure than you do if you're an immigration inspector after the people arrive. Everybody arrives at the same time and wants to get through the port, and you don't have very much time to deal with individuals. On the other hand, the flow of people arriving at the airport is different, and therefore the inspectors have more time to deal with what may be a risk question. And I noticed that neither of the government people, the Canadian government or the U.S. government people here today, mentioned this advantage, and I wondered if that's just illusory or if there is a real enforcement advantage to having more time to look at people on their way into the country. Thank you.
You guys want to take this? And I think it's a fair question, especially if you talk about the cost of the program and whether in a tight budgetary environment it makes sense, for these reasons or others.
Sure. It's a very good question, and actually there are both advantages and disadvantages, trade-offs, like in many programs. On the advantage side, you are extending a zone of security, if you will, pushing the border out and being able to address potential threats prior to boarding. I mean, this is something that we've seen, obviously, in the post-1225 environment. It's fairly critical to address threats, not just from a border security perspective, but from a broader homeland security perspective and protecting the conveyance en route, as well as potentially identifying a threat and denying entry at the border. So there is an advantage in that approach. That approach, however, doesn't mandate preclearance. There could be other types of approaches, an immigration advisory program that CBP maintains, or really just an advanced data and targeting effort in coordination with the carriers to address threats. So you can work on that pre-departure threat, address those threats pre-departure in a variety of ways. That saves a lot of money as well. The carriers don't have to transport people back. They don't face the fines. It saves a lot of time and energy for the arrival port as well. On the disadvantage side, at preclearance, we're dealing with much less time with the information about the person. There's more time with the person themselves, but we don't have the APIS transmissions. We have a confirmed identity of acronyms. It's a government hazard of duty here. APIS is the Advanced Passenger Information System. That's the transmission that the carriers make prior to departure, but fairly close to departure, with information on name, passport, date of birth, gender, country of origin, and so forth. That provides us a chance to look in our systems and assess the risk of an individual based on that data. That's not provided in advance in preclearance. The person is just walking up and presenting at primary their documents. So the lack of advanced information is a disadvantage. Also, the authorities question again comes up, and the security authorities are different when we're operating in a preclearance environment than we have at the U.S. border. As the Supreme Court has said, our authorities are Fourth Amendment type protections, and our authorities are at the zenith at the border. We have our biggest chance of applying a variety of techniques. That's not necessarily true in a preclearance environment, both in terms of a physical search and in terms of questioning and so forth. So there are advantages and disadvantages, and you raised some important aspects of both, sir.
Either of you want to jump in on this real quick? Or okay,
Pretty good.
next question. If you could raise your hand. All right, not seeing a question right this second. I'll ask a question. Based on the negotiations on the land preclearance that both of you talked about, I guess we've seen the Obama administration now turn its attention back to trade issues more generally, looking for ways to spur economic growth. The president has a national export initiative to try to double exports. I guess the question is, these security issues, the law enforcement authorities issue you mentioned, are these things that are likely to be re-looked at as a way to, again, to spur economic growth and to try to revisit things that maybe weren't solvable when the economy was growing at 5%, but might have a new life of their own now that our economy is really, both economies are having trouble? Is there a will to try to relook at some of these things that weren't able to be pulled off during the prior administration?
Would you like to go first, Paul?
Sure. I think it's not helpful, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's not helpful to contrast security and economic benefits. Sure. And I didn't. Right. It's just that some could hear that in your question. I think that back in post 9/11, we talked about smart borders, and it was getting the border right, getting the security in a way that also facilitated trade. So it's not like, well, a couple of years ago we were more focused on security, and now we're not because of the economies. So we're gonna sort of cut back on security and facilitate more. I don't think that's it. I think if anything, the state of the economy and quite frankly the point that Catherine left us with, how do we ensure that this highly integrated North American economy is competitive? And so we have to maintain and improve the security we have, while but in doing so we can't sort of hobble the border, hobble the economy. So I think it's forcing us to be more creative, but I don't think it's a question of a trade-off.
I agree, and I mean I think it's important to note that there was never a categorical rejection of preclearance concepts, despite the failure to reach fruition on the discussions that I think Paul, since he was involved directly, did a very good job of summarizing related to Buffalo. I think that the broader point, and Catherine I think also emphasized this, is that preclearance and related models of expediting trade and travel are going to be critical for this North American community and our economic competitiveness. And the clear marching orders that we have from our Secretary and Commissioner are to be very open to these concepts and to look at each one individually. I think Catherine's point that there are certain communities with different commodity structures, different infrastructure. We need to look at broad principles that I laid out in terms of the security, the efficiency, and the effectiveness of using a preclearance type model within the context of the local infrastructure, the local trade and traffic, and what would support what model would be most effective in each specific location. And we're open to all of that. We're soliciting proposals. We don't have to solicit because people are very aggressive and know where to find us, even if they sometimes get a FOIA request response. I promise I will never give you a FOIA response. But that's our position. We're very open. We have to be open given the challenges that Stuart referenced and the interest in both the Canadian and U.S. administrations in coming up with ways to foster trade and to help this economic rebound.
Catherine, can I ask you a quick question? Just living up in the border region, what do you think the attitude of the general man or woman is on the street on both sides of the border now, in terms of how they look at border enforcement and have we got the right balance? Have they? I know the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, the document requirement was quite controversial in that area before it was implemented. It seems to have gone reasonably smoothly. But what do you think the general mood is in terms of whether we've gotten the balance right?
In my view, I think that many stakeholders at the local level have felt in their pocketbooks the impact of enhanced security measures on the border. And again, recognizing that the economy, in particular in Buffalo, in Erie County, is so highly dependent upon our Canadian neighbors to the north in terms of shopping and tourism and Bills and Sabres games. I think at one point we estimated the economic impact of Canadian commerce on the economy, and I can't quite remember the number off the top of my head, but it was tremendous. It was a tremendous figure, and my sense is that those local stakeholders are feeling the pinch, have felt the pinch, but in my view, it's time to sort of move on. I mean, it's the reality of life that we're living in 2010, and people do need to think more creatively about ways to make the border thinner, I guess, is a way to put it. And in terms of creative ideas, I mean, you had asked whether the current economic climate is forcing policymakers here in Washington to revisit some of the ideas that didn't work in better economic times. And I would submit that something that shouldn't be lost on policymakers down here or in Ottawa, I was just talking to Miguel about this, is you have to recognize that the Canada-U.S. relationship is so different from any other relationship that Washington has with any other country in the world. And it's with all due respect to folks down here at DHS and the Department of State, you aren't the only people in the game. I mean, you have governors and you have folks in local government, and you have a whole host of stakeholders involved in these issues on a day-to-day basis, where some people actually argue that diplomacy between Canada and the United States has devolved to the states and local governments. And that's a characteristic, I think. I think that's an accurate characteristic, an accurate attribute of the relationship. And it's one that you could think about in terms of trying to find creative solutions to some of these issues, maybe engaging some of these stakeholders. I mean, I don't have the solution, but I'm just saying it's an attribute of the relationship that makes it unique, that might provide some food for thought for folks down here.
I see a question in the back left, hiding next to the microphone.
Of American States. Just actually picking up on Catherine's question there in terms of local border communities and how you can make the border thinner. I was just wondering if there are any lessons learned from the U.S.-Mexico border that could be implied with or applied to the Canada-U.S. border in terms of local initiatives and facilitating transportation both for local residents and for local businesses. Obviously, the situations are very different, but just some questions on that. Thank you.
Kevin, you have the responsibility for the whole world, so good luck with that.
Yes, that's a good question. I'll highlight one specific example, and as we sit and think and listen to the panel, maybe I can think of some other particulars that we can talk about after the discussion this morning. But one area is, and Catherine raised this point as well, is on the wait times. We are really endeavoring to come up with a consistent, tri-national, not binational view of how to measure, how to share information about wait times, and how to lessen them at both borders. And there are ongoing studies on the northern and the southern border. The work on the southern border, I think, is more comprehensive. There are 7 or 8 different corridors that are being studied with the Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration, the border master planning groups in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. All jointly looking at the situation and trying to think as broadly as possible about ways to impact that situation. As we're looking at it at the northern border a little bit more narrowly, I think we can take some of those lessons on the southwest border from the wait times process and the interagency, binational interagency studies and apply them hopefully on the northern border. we do feel like we have stats. Paul and I talked about it while Catherine was questioning us. I'm sorry about the red X. I don't have a red X stamp on my desk, but I understand that sometimes it is hard to effectively share information. But we recognize that they need to be improved and they need to be made consistent. And we need to do a lot better job sharing that information. There's some really innovative ideas out there. If you look at the Buffalo situation with 4 bridges, a variety of options, it'd be very helpful to communicate real-time information to passenger vehicles and commercial trucks about wait times at specific bridges and let people divert at an earlier point in the process to one with less traffic. That shouldn't be impossible to do in this day and age, and we shouldn't necessarily need to wait for someone to develop an iPhone app to help us do that. We should be able to figure out a way to communicate those things. So that's one area where there's definitely shared lessons. I mean, there are a lot of contrasts, obviously, in the two borders. Very, very different security situation, especially in the last couple of years. So we have a lot of challenges on the southwest border that we don't face on the northern border. But if you look at how to work around limited infrastructure, how do you work around the common queue problem that Catherine highlighted, which is a major issue, those are the kind of things that we apply lessons from the southwest border to the northern border and vice versa.
A question that you got to me first over here. I'm sorry? You want to jump? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to tack on it very quickly. A couple of points. It goes back to what Catherine said and what Kevin's just said about wait times. I think the slide shows that, let's say at in BC, Washington State, that the FAST program really works. Wait times for FAST are really significantly lower than they are for the general traveling public. But if you asked business people out there, they'd probably still be complaining about the difficulty of getting stuff across the border. And I think we have to distinguish wait times from kind of border compliance costs writ large. Like, how much more difficult, expensive, time-consuming is it to get something from one side of the border to the other than it is to get it down the road within one country? I think that's, and border wait times are a piece of that. But I think if we focus on border wait times in and of itself, we're gonna avoid addressing a big whack of the problem. And it gets back to an issue that Kevin mentioned, which is, I think, single entry, where you're trying to sort of get all the requirements to clear from all the departments on one form electronically, so that the driver isn't showing up with all kinds of paper and stuff. We're doing the same in Canada. And so if we can get to the point where it's one form, it's electronic, and perhaps it's harmonized between the two countries, or maybe not harmonized, but at least on one document, that'll save huge amounts of not time at the border, not sitting waiting in the cab of the truck, but back at head office or back at the regional office, preparing the forms, getting the data, et cetera. So we just have to look at the border more broadly than just wait times.
Stuart, can I add one other point? Briefly, in the interest of real-time government-private sector information sharing here, and statisticians always caveat things. This is what BlackBerries are for. These are average wait times across all locations at all operational hours, so they do not emphasize the peaks or the worst wait times, but for a general representation, using fourth quarter 2010 stats, so current situation, average northern border truck wait times for FAST are 50% lower. And average personal vehicle wait times for Nexus are 75% lower. So, in terms of our internal counts, there's quite a difference in the trusted trader and trusted traveler programs. Send you this email.
Thank you.
Back to our regular scheduled program. Question over here.
Ernie Bartucci, the Government of Ontario. I just want to. My question relates to the comments that Kevin just made and Catherine made, and I think it's. And I wanted to comment on what Paul just said, because I think to be internationally competitive, the cost of the border, not just in time, has to be factored in, given the integrated nature of our economy, and particularly in advanced manufacturing, but I think across the spectrum of our economy. So I would leave that as a comment. I think it's an important one. But my question was going to be, and And given, and Kevin's statistics bear this out, given that trusted traveler programs are successful in terms of reducing the primary and perhaps secondary wait times, what is it that we can do to leverage that, to make that a real advantage, where, for example, where infrastructure permits, to give them more lanes or faster service. But what is it that we can do to, if only 23% in the Buffalo and Aggregate Way are fast customers, what do we do for the balance of that, the 70-odd%? And what can we do about that, both at the national level, but certainly at the regional or provincial level, to enhance the advantage, to bring more people into that, given, I think the jury's in, it's very successful programs.
Do you want to comment on this? You guys want to, either one of you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. That's a question that our folks in the CTPAT, FAST, and Global Entry Nexus program management side work on every day, and it's something that our commissioner is driving us to be more innovative about. And it's I'll give you a couple examples on the trusted traveler side. We are trying to work with the key industry partners who are most impacted by these programs, American Airlines, other major carriers, Marriott, for instance, to try to use their networks, their frequent flyers, their frequent travelers, and send out information to encourage them to consider participation in our trusted programs. I think Catherine's stats and discussion of the challenges on the FAST program and increasing participation, the difference between the Pacific Northwest and Buffalo, and I'm not validating your stats, but I think you raised some provocative questions. How do we assess the difference in commodities and supply chains and the impact they have on participation in these programs, and are there ways to work to encourage companies with different supply chain profiles that might have trouble meeting all the requirements of FAST to join? How do we reach out locally and walk them through a process to increase that participation? I think those are questions we need to ask ourselves, and Todd Owen, our CTPAT executive director, is not here to help me with this answer, but I think I'm going to take back some of the questions and ideas that came up today and try to address that exact point. I mean, it's our constant challenge. How do we increase participation? Because it helps us so much to move people into that segment that we don't have to worry about in terms of the overall process. And frankly, as Paul pointed out, it's not a dichotomy between security and facilitation. They're one and the same. The more people we facilitate, the more security we'll have, because we can focus limited resources more precisely. So it's a key aspect.
Sure. Just to chip in on what Kevin said, I think there's a couple of things going on already. I mean, one of the things we can do, it's all about increasing the benefits of being in the program, and that way more people will want to be in the program, and that way the infrastructure dedicated to the program will be used, and that makes the argument for more infrastructure. So in some cases we have infrastructure sitting there dedicated and it's not used. So it's how do we get the membership up while maintaining the security and integrity of the programs? One thing we are doing is we have, in Canada we have PIP, and in the United States there's CTPAT. And if you landed today from Mars and looked at them, you'd say these are the same thing, except they're different. And except, the companies have to go through two processes, and, it's a pain. It's an unnecessary, or one could argue it's an unnecessary additional cost. So our folks that are responsible for PIP are sitting down with CBP folks that are responsible for CTPAT and saying, look, can we not kind of, streamline these things into what's essentially one program, so that you apply once, you get approved once, you submit your data, so you don't go through this two-step thing. So again, that's a small step, but it's an important step in improving the benefits of the program. As Kevin said, you have to go back in history. The FAST program was really designed with the sort of New York State, Michigan, Ontario manufacturing-based auto industry in mind. That's what it was, and it's worked for them. Now, lo and behold, we find out that, if you're shipping processed food products from BC to Washington State, you don't have a lot of people lining up to join fast. Well, that doesn't surprise us. So, as Kevin says, we got to sit down and together look at ways, because what you don't want to do is have the U.S. expand fast in one way and we expand fast in another way. So we got to keep it joint and try to find creative ways to maintain the security, integrity, screening of the program, but increase its membership not only to other sectors, but to try to find a way to improve it for small and medium-sized businesses.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. You were next over here on the left.
Ron Reines with the Peace Bridge.
Hold on, we're recording this.
Thank you. Ron Reines with the Peace Bridge. Nexus and FAST are good programs. There's also the other programs. The Enhanced Driver's License program from WHI is a very successful program in Erie County, not so much in Ontario for a number of reasons. You have the passport card as well. Catherine, you said that the Nexus program really doesn't impact the commercial programs. It actually does. Nexus is a car program, but if you have these trusted traveler programs working well, it directly impacts how commerce gets across the border because you get the cars out of the way. Makes a huge difference as how those programs work. They're also integrated from the perspective of being directly tied to the infrastructure availability. You can't market those programs if they're only good for the last couple hundred feet. You need to be able to get through the whole system in a manner that makes sense. And in that vein, I have two questions, one for Kevin and one for Paul. Kevin, we've been involved, as you know, 10 years in terms of improving infrastructure. We've been involved in the NEPA program. But it's not only our crossing that's struggling with infrastructure. All the four major ports of entry, Port Huron, Detroit, Peace Bridge at Buffalo, and Lewiston, are the four major ports. No dollars have been committed for infrastructure improvements at those ports. That's a problem. We need to address that. And I'd like to hear your comments on is there going to be the opportunity in another round of stimulus funding to make some of those improvements? And the question for Paul is, Canadian government has done a much better job with the physical infrastructure at the border than the U.S. government has not done such a good job from a technological infrastructure perspective. The booths aren't instrumented to accept enhanced driver's license or passport cards or Nexus cards when people are traveling when the Nexus booth is not open. So really that's an infrastructure question for both of you. It's different, but it really affects how the border functions.
Sure, and I think you ask a very good question, and the succinct answer is that a problem that there's no infrastructure investment in the four major crossings of the northern border? No question. I mean, it's an easy one to just say yes. I won't stop right there because that wouldn't be fair. But in terms of additional stimulus funding, I don't know if that's going to be forthcoming. It does not appear that that's a major opportunity. I can tell you, Stuart mentioned my brief sojourn in the private sector. That's one thing advocated for strongly, that for the last round of stimulus funding, that a major portion of it be directed to border infrastructure, because what better stimulates both the local economies, construction industry, but also the trinational economy in North America than border infrastructure, and some of it was directed in that way to some of the CBP owned ports of entry. Then you get into the complexities of the GSA owned, the local property owned bridges and so forth, and we could go maybe port by port. Would want an expert or two with me to answer all those questions. But a lot of projects have been on the table for some time. An additional bridge in New York, an expansion for Blue Water. Some of the things were well along in the design phase. We were hoping to get funding. That's not there right now, and it's something we're going to continue to advocate for because we can't be effective in a lot of these locations, as effective as we'd like to be in the facilitation aspect without increased infrastructure, and we appreciate your support and advocacy on these issues, and we're sort of on the same page, I would say, in this area.
Well, just thank you for your kind words on the physical infrastructure side. On the in terms of the readers and that, we're aware. We're trying to do more. We have done a bit more. We got a lot more to do. I can't really speak to what we're going to do. It's where I come from, those are decisions made by my minister and others. But we're aware that we've got some catching up to do.
One comment I had, and I'm looking over to our host, how much, we're a little bit over time. Do we need to wrap up here? Or?
We should probably wrap up.
Okay, well, just one comment I'll just make on that was that the appropriations process, which our Congress works on, U.S. Congress, if they are truly going to have no earmarks, which has been talked about by Speaker Boehner, that will change how money flows out for infrastructure dramatically, because you won't have members of Congress picking out, exactly the bridge, the tunnel, the port of entry, the whatever, and it will go into kind of either a federal grants to states or some grant-making process at DOT or other agencies, and it won't be kind of Congress picking out things. I'm not sure if it's good or bad for ports of entry and those types of things, but it will be a major sea change in terms of how Congress operates. So I apologize. I know there's a couple of people that had their hand up. I guess we should probably try to take those questions offline. If the panelists wouldn't mind us sticking around for a minute out in the hall. Are you going to take a break, or do you just want to move to a second panel? So before we wrap up, I'd just like if everyone give a round of applause to our panelists. And if you could plan on being back in here about 10 of 11, you'll get started on your next panel. So thank you so much.